All right, hello everybody. Take two here. My name is Nick Bonatakis, a software freelancer, and I'm here with Adam Nelson, design freelancer. How's it going, Adam?
Doing good.
Perfect. So, what are we talking about today, my friend?
So today's topic, inspired from a LinkedIn post that I saw, is essentially on the topic of hiring. And I don't know if we're going to get to both sides of the coin because there's, the interviewers and the interviewees and everything. But the LinkedIn post that got me inspired was essentially this. It said, "Hey folks, anyone interested in giving advice to a new food tech startup that's looking to make its first engineering hires?" Specific topics: what's the best way to find and recruit early engineering talent? And what are the key qualities that make a good early engineering hire? So, around that, I think we decided that the best thing to do is kind of for the next hour answer these questions and touch on a number of other topics that surround the same thing.
Sure, sure.
So, especially we got two unique perspectives here. We have you, engineering side, and that's what this person's specifically interested in hearing about. And I think we could also talk about the design side because that's where I come from, and even product driven side.
Yep.
So let's get started. I think I want to kind of hear about your personal experience because you came up. I mean, you've been in the business now like 15-ish years.
Yeah.
How did you go about getting your first job? Did you go the internship route?
So, I did do. So when I was in school, like the last year of Worcester Poly is, and I think it's still this way, is like you have to do like a major qualifying project, and like most people do that somewhere on site for like 3 or 4 months. So I did an internship. It was at eBay, but I didn't end up staying out in Silicon Valley. I came back here. So I guess yes and no. Like I did an internship was kind of my first gig, but I didn't transition that into full time. So my first full time was out in a company that used to do marketing automation software. Super exciting stuff out in Waltham. But I just did the typical kind of interview circuit. Um, just
Was that sarcasm?
it was. I mean, it was a fun company to work at for a while, and then it kind you can only to me I can you can only work on enterprise software for so long before you start losing your sanity.
Hey,
Um,
before you jump into that company, so
yeah.
it sounds like you had at Worcester Polytech sort of like a 6-month science fair of sorts, and then companies got to go pick through the pool of candidates, right?
Yeah, so they did we had the job fair thing, every so often where they had people coming on campus to like try to recruit people, but like those were usually, and I don't know if it's still this way, but those were usually dominated by larger companies. So you'd get the Microsofts and the Googles and IBMs and all that stuff. And so if you wanted to work for one of those shops, like that was a good way to like start that process.
Mhm.
I wasn't super interested in doing that from the get go. And so I really didn't, I don't think I really got too much out of the job fairs. Like my first job, I literally found from just trolling Craigslist and like back then, a lot of job listings happen on Craigslist. That's probably not as much the case these days. There's all these other sites, but
Yeah.
and just firing off my at that time scant resume to people, and I had a bunch of bites. I did like probably interviewed with like 3 or 4 companies, and this one just worked out well in terms of the team and the fit and all that stuff, and so that's how I kind of ended up there. um,
So what were you just looking for any job, or did like that job posting and that Craigslist posting really resonate with you? Like how did you know?
I think for the first one, like I was just looking for anything, like I wanted, I didn't want to. I was coming out of school. I didn't want to move back to my parents' basement, so
Uh-huh.
it was like I need to land something, and it needs to be by X time, a couple weeks after graduation or whatever, and um, that was kind of it. And so more or less like the first thing that offered me a decent package, I was like, all right, let's do this. I mean, the team was good. I interviewed with a bunch of people. It was actually the folks that I was working with at the company at the time was I think like 300 or so folks, but they
Oh,
had
that's
what's
more
that?
than medium sized in my opinion.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the interesting thing was like the team that I had was joining was like part of they were basically a much smaller startup that had just gotten acquired. So like it had
Oh.
like it was more of a tight knit feel, and I was kind of insulated from the rest of the company for at least like a year or two, and got to work with these folks in sort of more of a lean startup kind of mode. um, for that time, which was good. But yeah, to going back to your original question, like I wasn't super picky at the time. Like I think in terms of like getting your first job, like it's almost more important than your schooling or where you went to school. Like once you have a good like job or two on your resume, like where you went to school doesn't matter as much. At least that's my experience because even in like the first like 3 months of doing a full time job, like you get so much more experience than what you learn in school. And so, to me, it's like for people early in their career, like you just got to get a win on the board as early as possible, and then you can leverage that after that to get something better, and be a little bit more picky about what you want to do.
Yeah, for sure. So, like, put yourself in this guy's shoes really quick. I know he mentioned food tech startup, but um, that might not even matter.
Yeah.
If
So
you were fishing for a team, let's say you've got a budget and you can support 3 engineering hires, and you are the first there as the tech person. How would you go about today seeking that talent with the resources that you have or the pull, the name that you have? It's
yeah,
probably not at all, right?
sure. Yeah. So I think when you're talking about like early engineering hires, you're really talking for a startup like that. Um, you
Let's
want
get more serious on that budget. I think that's really you're going to get one new hire. That's all you get, actually.
Sure, sure. So one new hire, right? You're going to get one new hire. Um, I think hire number one needs to be somebody that's super versatile, right? I think that's most people that have worked at startups know this because you can't just expect to be working like what you're going to do if you work at a Google or a Microsoft. Like you're going to be doing everything, from day one. So like they may bring you in there to be, maybe you may be hired to focus on mobile, for example, or whatever, but like you definitely need somebody that's not scared to get their feet wet in pretty much whatever thing needs to happen, right? So you need people that while they may be focused, need to be able to be generalists as well. And so I think that's a certain brand of person um, you don't necessarily find everywhere. Some people are perfectly content just jumping into a big company and kind of doing position play for the bulk of their career, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. It's like specializing, I think, is fine, but you definitely, I think, for an early startup, early hire, you want a generalist, right? I
Yeah, for
think,
sure.
and so like I guess the question then becomes like, how do you find people like that?
Totally. It's not something that, like, how do you screen for that? Because if you ask pretty direct questions in interview settings, folks want a job. You can kind of
Yeah,
guess what that interviewee or that interviewer wants to hear if the question isn't, if your questions aren't designed to screen for or seek out a certain type of thing, and they're just yes or no questions, you can play your cards right and get in.
yeah, and I think that's where a lot of it comes down to like, what do when I was in the role of hiring folks, like, and I know this is kind of to some people this is faux pas to ask people like, what's your side projects or what sorts of things do you work on the side? Like, I don't,
Really? Why do you think that's faux pas?
I think it's becoming faux pas because I think some people see it as kind of almost like there's an expectation that you're doing all this work outside of your day job or whatever. Um, but and so to ask that, you're almost setting the expectation that like we're not going to hire somebody that's not ready to just like spend all of their time on Earth programming 80 hours a week or whatever. I don't personally see it that way. I think people that have side projects, it's typically something they're interested in doing, and they're doing it because they enjoy it, and it's not something they're forced to do. But so like setting the expectation that I personally don't think there's anything wrong with that, or even asking about that. With the understanding that like if somebody said to me, yeah, I don't really do a lot of programming outside of work, like that's fine too. But I think it's an easy way to identify somebody that is versatile and is a generalist just based on what sorts of things they work on, right? So like for
Hmm.
example, if somebody's doing an app that they want to spin up, they have some kind of project. I mean, it's some apps you can do without any kind of back end experience or whatever, but like in most cases, like you have to do some kind of back end to do anything moderately sophisticated. So if you have somebody that comes in and says, "Well, yeah, I built this little app, and like I even built like a little back end for it because it needed to do X, Y, Z," like to me, right there, that's evidence of like somebody who's willing to like step outside of what they're comfort zone is to like do whatever they need to do to get the product out the door. Um,
Yeah.
and that kind of thing it's easy to see, it's easy to demonstrate. It's not something that people can like really lie about when if you ask them questions like interview wise or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. I
And
totally agree. I actually look for that, and I recommend folks put at least one passion project in their portfolio, especially if they're coming out of school. I
yeah,
want to see that they've like pursued design projects that haven't been guided by a school assignment, or like they've actually gone after spec work, or they just did something because they wanted to do it. Because essentially in design, and I have a feeling in the same, for your career track, you only learn by making a ton of mistakes. And I want people to make the mistakes on their own time and be and be like hyper valuable when they get in the door. So if someone is already out there learning and making mistakes on their own, that means the value they can deliver is higher than the person that isn't learning on their own, you
right.
know?
Yep. Yeah, totally. And I think that's one thing that there's some hesitation about from people is like, and I think we've talked about this before, is like this idea of like talking about things that you've done that have been failures or not. And I think,
Oh yeah, yeah.
I think it's way better to talk about things that you failed on and kind of embrace that, because I look at every failure as like as long as I learned something from that, like then it was a valuable exercise in my time. So like I think especially for people that are early in their career, like if you're trying to get a job somewhere, like people love to hear about failures, especially startup founders or CTOs or whatever. Like they've all probably had failed startups in their past, like
Yeah, for
they
sure.
understand that. And like people that are willing to acknowledge the fact that they've done something and failed at, as long as they've kind of have a good understanding of what they've learned, is great. I mean, that's the most valuable experience in my mind. So I think that's another great indicator of somebody who's kind of equipped really well for that kind of role. Um,
Mhm.
Failures are the best. I mean, the successes are better, but like,
They're the
uh,
best if you've learned something from them, and not just something, but like I kind of want to just say the right lesson from them, because you can totally come away from something that didn't work out and have the wrong attitude about it, especially when it comes to like interpersonal politics or something. You can like it's just a canary in a coal mine when an interview candidate, like when a candidate starts to talk about a bad experience and they place all the failure on somebody else.
yeah,
Or, you know what I mean? Like there's a right way to fail. There's an attitude about it that you need to like keep your ears open for.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, like quick anecdote, like for me, like when I started at Raise Labs, like prior to that job, like I wasn't doing mobile full time. Like I was so like I had been doing infrastructure kind of work and sort of back end and a little bit of web and that sort of thing for,
Mhm.
4 or 5 years, 6 years before Raise. Um, and I don't, in that time, like for the 2 years leading up to when I ended up getting that job, like I was working with like a bunch of guys on, I'd call it sort of a little startup, like a mobile sort of game app thing.
Mhm.
And we did everything. Like we did the app and the whole back end and all that stuff, and tried to actually market it and all that stuff. And it was definitely an unmitigated failure, like at the end, in terms. And there's a number of reasons of why that happened, but
Indie games is rough to get into.
yeah, no kidding, right? But on the plus side, like I don't think I would have had the confidence to go into an agency like that was doing that kind of work for companies, and be able to actually have any kind of confidence that I'd be able to like jump right in and start working on that stuff had I not done that experience. And
Yeah, yeah.
at my day job, like we had mobile efforts going on, but like it was a big organization. Like I had tried to move over to that, and it was kind of there were reasons why I couldn't shift over to that. And so like I think for me it was like I just mobile was something I wanted to do, and so like I just did it right, like on my own. And so I think that's another thing. It's like if you're at a big company and you're feeling like you want to get some experience doing something and you can't, the company won't let you, just go off and do it on your own time, like because there's no other way that it's going to happen. And like to get a job and switch jobs to some other tech focus or whatever, it's way easier to have some prior experience, even if it's like on your own time or whatever. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I mean,
Okay.
so going back to the question at hand, I think that's kind of my input on it from the engineering side.
Well, I know there's coding homework, right? What can you tell me about like sifting through and assigning homework, and like what are your thoughts on that practice in seeking talent?
Yeah, so I have sort of contrarian thoughts on
Well,
interviews and
did you go through that? I mean,
I
have you
went
done the coding homework and
yeah,
shit?
yeah, I've gone through every brand of like interview slash coding homework slash whatever. The only thing that I haven't done, which I actually think is the best version, if there's a way to make it work in a way that's like fair, is the idea of like we're going to bring you on as a contractor for a week or whatever, have you fix a bunch of stuff or solve a bunch of stuff and then decide if we want to keep you full time or not. I actually
Yeah,
think
yeah.
that's like the best possible way to hire a full-time employee, but I think barring that, the
But
coding
try before you buy.
yeah, exactly. The coding homework I think is a much lighter version of that, and I think I've been on both sides of that coin. I've done some coding homeworks. I've like assessed a ton of coding homeworks. It's
Yeah.
definitely better than like here's a whiteboard and a stupid question that like you could Google for the answer for in like 5 minutes. Like I'm not a big
Is it
proponent of.
because those questions are there's definitely a right answer and definitely a wrong answer?
I mean, not necessarily, but like there's an entire industry of people schlepping products, books, courses, and all this stuff around how to quote unquote ace programming interviews. So like
Yeah.
literally a lot of these companies, a lot of these larger companies that don't really that it takes them a lot longer to change their processes when it comes to this sort of thing.
They've
People
been
are
gamed.
yeah, exactly. They're not like people are not coming in there. You're not assessing in many cases you're not assessing somebody's ability to be a good engineer on your product team or whatever. You're assessing how well they've studied the interview questions and like
Yeah,
anticipated
yeah.
what sorts of things you're going to ask them and are able to recite the answer on a whiteboard. Like that sucks. I just don't think you're learning much about somebody in that kind of situation. So I think coding home like barring bringing somebody on in some contract capacity to actually do some work. And on like if you did that, I think you pay the person, right? You say this is the rate we'll give you, and here's like here's some some feature or some bug that we want to fix, and go ahead and do that, and we'll add you to our Slack, and you can talk to our folks and whatever. That's ideal.
Yeah.
But the coding homework thing is another one. I think um, you can do it. I think the key is just I like to make it I like it when it's a pretty super constrained problem, like a fairly straightforward thing. So I think at Raise for a while we were doing just like implement a simple like weather app with like the current temperature in your location or whatever.
Where do they
Uh,
get the data?
at the time we were just using the Dark Sky API, like we just give that information or whatever. That's since been shuttered because Apple bought them, but there's probably some other weather API that you can use that. But yeah, I mean, so give them the endpoint of the API or whatever, and then you can learn a lot from somebody based on what they do in that kind of situation. Like
Mhm.
I think you typically want to time box it. Well, I don't know. I'm a little bit of two minds on this, right? Because like I think if you time box it, you can definitely find out it kind of equals the playing field a little bit in terms of like what the expectations are. But on the flip side, like we had some people come in there and like just wow the shit out of us, right? Like
Oh
they
yeah.
put such effort into it, made it look super nice, like handle all these edge cases that like you wouldn't see often, and like that's like an easy like okay, this person
Did those people
clearly
get off?
yeah, yeah. I mean, in most cases, that's something that that's a super high probability that you get an offer on that.
Mhm.
Um, so I don't know. I'd be curious on other people's thoughts on that kind of idea. It's like on the one hand, like you kind of want to grade people on the same scale, but then on the other hand, like you don't want to. I don't want to punish people for like actually giving a shit and like doing extra effort to make the thing, really
Oh,
awesome.
for
And you know,
yeah, I think it shows a ton of initiative. That's what you want out of an employee anyway. When you say, okay, here's the problem we're trying to solve. This is what success looks like. They need to come back, like as a junior employee, they need to come back, have solved the problem, done that, and then done a bunch of extra stuff that you didn't even ask for. That's what makes a stellar employee, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think on the flip side of it, there's something to be said around like how do you assess somebody's ability to work in like a constrained environment is, and most of the time it's time that's the constraint, so like
Mm-hmm.
you do want to be able to understand what kind of trade-offs they had to make because of XYZ, because that's the flip side of it. Like you don't want somebody that's going to come in and overcomplicate the hell out of everything,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
because they just can't. That's just not the reality, right? Like we don't have infinite time for everything. So um,
I think
yeah.
that's for an early hire. I think that's the type of thing that I would be screening for as well. Like the type of people who are simplifiers versus complicators. Um,
Yeah.
because like getting something done is far outweighs the value of getting something, and this is in quotes, perfect, because perfect doesn't exist. It's an illusion.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to startup, like you're going to be constantly breaking things and rebuilding things and pivoting and
Shifting and pivoting for sure.
yeah, and like you just can't get married to anything. It's like you have to be very okay with blowing away tons of code and like resetting things and
Yeah.
um,
Like listening to you talk about this, I started to think there's two, I think there's two different candidates we were having in mind when we were talking about this. Sometimes I was thinking of a super junior candidate that would just showed me raw passion about wanting to work, wanting to learn, and wanting to be involved in the organization. But if I was hiring for more of a senior role or somebody, like I would not, I've refused to do homework before for an interviewing thing. I didn't even want to do this interview. A certain amount of circumstances made me do this interview.
yeah.
Um, but they asked me to do homework, and instead of doing the homework, I wrote a Google Doc of how I would get to the solution versus bringing them a bunch of solutions, because the things that they asked me were directly related to their business. I just thought it was unethical. I just thought it was like, you're asking me to do a bunch of free work. Guess what? I don't need this job. And so like, I don't know how they felt about that. I did get an offer. It wasn't a great one, but at some, like, you're not going to ask every engineer to do a bunch of coding homework, are you? There's a certain threshold where you're just like, this person's way more senior than that, and it would be almost insulting to hand them this stupid document.
Yeah, and I've been at companies where that's been the case, right? Like you make the judgment call and say like, all right, yeah, this person clearly like they've been doing this for 10 years and like here's all these things they've worked on and they have references or whatever, like
Yeah.
this is stupid. Like we're not like I have to go code a weather app, right?
Well, I mean, I probably don't have the time,
Yeah,
especially if they're employed.
sure. I mean, yeah, yes and no. I don't know. I feel like this is a common complaint I have about just people in general. I feel like everybody can make the time for something. It's just about if prioritization is really what it's about, right? Like, do you want
Mhm.
if you want the job, you can make an hour or two to do the thing, right? I mean, yeah. Again, it
Is
gets
that
in.
all it takes? Is that what we're taking? Because the homework that I was asked to do at the level that I would do it at a being employed at this place, it was a 6 to 8 hour endeavor.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think that's like the maximum upper bounds of what I would ever expect somebody to do, and
And that's
probably much
$1,000,
lower.
buddy. That's what I'm gonna charge for
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, well, so that I mean that goes back to people being empowered too. Like if you have the portfolio to show it and you have the experience to show it, then you should just say no to that kind of shit. Which like that's my policy now. Is like I just don't do that kind of stuff ever. Um,
Yeah.
so uh, you know, I, I see both sides of it, and I've seen both sides of it. It's hard
So
to evaluate somebody. That's just the fact, no matter
yeah,
how
I
you
mean,
slice it.
we haven't touched on this piece yet, and I think it's worth noting the types of questions you should be asking in an interview are behavioral interview questions, and the stories that they tell, and the questions that you ask should really be focused on seeking out the values and the strengths and weaknesses that you know are going to work in your organization. Like I was asking different questions at Chewy than I was asking at Raise Labs, because when I got into Chewy, I realized, wow, someone who can last long and perform well here is a slightly different DNA. Like everyone's a talented designer when it comes down to it, but success at Chewy looked a lot different than success at Raise Labs. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I believe you, but how so? Tell me more. Like how?
Well, at Raise Labs, being out on your own as a designer, seeking feedback from others around you versus oh, we have a meeting where everyone's going to dogpile and give me feedback. Like that wasn't happening. It's like being able to sell on your own. Like everyone, we were hiring, mid to senior level people pretty much exclusively at Raise Labs. If
Yeah.
so, hyper strong communicators, very comfortable in client meetings, the type of person to get a problem and just say, okay, I've never solved a problem like this before, but I'm going to figure it out and just go do it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when it came time to like sell that work, we were backed by some of the, people were coming in the door paying through the nose already. So guess what? All of a sudden, everyone's an expert on the other side of the table because you've already signed the contract, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty much paying them to be the experts that they are. So selling the work wasn't that difficult there, in my opinion, for me anyway. But so on the contrast, selling work up a food chain of a bunch of people who probably are only empowered to say no, because that's all it was, really. Like, yeah, they have power. They have a power to kill something, but they don't have a power to yes something a lot of the times.
Yeah.
So in that kind of environment, you need to be hyper resilient. You need to be like, okay, I got shat on 3 times this week by different parties, and I'm making a bunch of changes. And the speed as well, the speed of things getting to market. You need people who, like, it's odd enough, like at Chewy, we screened for all levels. We were ready to hire at all levels, right?
Yeah.
And at Raise Labs, we were only ready to hire the senior people. The thing about senior people in the creative space is they've seen a shit ton of their stuff die on the vine or die because of client feedback. Half of their, 75% of their creative endeavors are on the, editing room floor, right?
Yeah.
So they're okay with that. They've experienced that. Junior people have to get over that, and it takes a lot of knocks. It's only the only thing to get there is time.
Yeah.
And fails, and in realizing how shitty the business can be sometimes. So at Chewy, where that happened all the time, we were getting junior people, and some of the one-on-one sessions were almost like therapy for them, for junior folks, and having them understand that this is part of the business, and moving on and going to the next project is all part of the, part of being at work.
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, yeah, it's interesting that you can draw so many parallels between the design world and the engineering world in that regard. I think that's kind of a similar story, although it's sort of you slice it a little bit differently. It's really more around like I talk about this idea of like getting married to your code and that sort of thing, and like
Oh yeah.
that's something that I think junior folks have a hard time with. Even senior, like even when you're more senior, it's still you have to really consciously be okay with deleting code, right? Because you have to do it all the time, and it's this idea of like, oh, I built this thing, and now the requirements have changed, and it needs before it did X, and now it needs to do Y, but oh, it did X so well, and like, does it really does it really have to do Y like this? And
Mhm.
getting to that point to be able to say like, yeah, okay, like it doesn't need to do this anymore, or it needs to be different. Like, let's delete a bunch of code and rewrite it, or start or change it in XYZ way. You'll see this. You've probably seen the other side of this from the design side of like you go to a developer and say like, all right, like this is what this screen needs to look like, and they say, well, we already built it this way, so it can't do that. Like we already did this, so we can't do that because it'd be too hard because of X, Y, Z, a bunch of gobbledygook that you probably don't understand or care about.
I haven't seen a trip. Well, I haven't seen a lot of that in my career, and I think why is because before development gets started, I've already shown them like at least whiteboards or little sketches the direction I want to take it,
Yeah,
and I've let them weigh in on the things that they think are important, or limitations that they don't want to tackle, or preferences, and I try to like shepherd the team into a solution as early as possible, getting all the opinions at the table,
yeah,
as early as possible. I'm not the kind of guy to be like, all right, they're going to go do the back end and get started on. I'm going to go work by myself for 3 weeks and then present. You know what I mean?
yeah, and
That's a recipe for a disaster.
yeah, that's a great way to prevent that kind of stuff. Is like start talking about it as early as possible. Like, what do we want to do? How do we want to do this screen? Or figure out all the different components and like what are they going to look like, and we could do a whole show on components and like how to set up a good project and styles and all that stuff, and maybe we should, because I think it's like a super valuable thing that's often missed, especially at startups where you're going like 1,000 miles an hour. Um,
Mhm.
but ultimately can save you like so much time in the end. Yeah, that's interesting. So yeah, I mean, I think we've covered most of that question. Was there a part of that question around like how to find people or where to find people? Because that's a thing that I've gotten asked before. Is like,
I think it's really, yeah, I think you could talk about that for sure. And because it changes all the time, you know. I
yeah,
found my first job on Craigslist as well because it was one of the only places that I felt like there was a real human connection behind some of the job postings.
yep,
It was like somebody is asking, my first job was at an apparel company, and the types of questions they were asking, it was almost as if, and it was a startup-ish type, there were only 8 people. They were asking things like, what's your favorite band? What's the last three books you read? It was like they were screening for a friend.
yeah,
And I just answered everything really honestly, and that felt great. Whereas traditional job postings that come out of like Monster or Indeed or whatever, at least back then, were written by a bunch of recruiting people and probably analyzed by machines. You know, like the
yeah. I don't think that's changed. I mean, yeah, it's like the same kind of thing
yeah,
with
that
all.
piece hasn't at all.
Yeah, and I think if you're especially like a startup founder or whatever, and you're trying to find an early hire, I think like Indeed or any of that crap is just a waste of time, because like, I mean, the people you want are not looking at Indeed, or any of that stuff.
Where are they looking? That's a great insight. Where are the people that you want actually looking for work?
Well, I think any recruiter will probably tell you that they're not looking, right? Like a
Oh,
lot of
it's
times
a
the
great,
people you want are not looking, right?
well,
They're
no, I think that's, what about the person coming out of college
sure,
or
sure. And that I don't have as much insight into where I mean, certainly time was like you could get some bang out of the buck for career fairs. Like I think there were when we were at Raise, I think we did a few of them, and I think we picked up a bunch of people, like really good people from like BC, BU. I think that's where like Dick Lucas came
oh
from
yeah,
and a
that's
few
where
other
Dick came from.
folks. Yeah, and so like you can definitely get some mileage out of that. I think like one avenue that I think that we did tap on Raise a decent amount, but I think for startups, you're not probably not thinking about it too much, but in terms of just thought leadership on sort of engineering things is a good way to reach people. Like either have an engineer that works for you start writing some content, or
Yeah.
even just hire somebody to do it. Just but like something like technical, right? Like the other engineers are going to find because it solves their problem or whatever, or even just being active on Stack Overflow or those sorts of things. Open source is another great one. um, I mean, I've definitely read things before that where I've come across them because I'm trying to find some solution to something or other, and I'll look to see like what company did this or like who wrote this or whatever, and
Hmm.
that's definitely one surefire way that you can have people funnel in to find out more about your company,
Yeah, yeah.
at the engineering side of things. I imagine it's similar for design. I mean, do you guys get like do you think companies would get mileage out of doing um
Oh, for sure. And everyone's doing it.
yeah,
Spotify, Atlassian, Airbnb, Google, of course, Apple, of course. Anyone who publishing thought leadership, like Material Design Blog just launched this week, and they've been putting out, thought leadership
yeah,
since 2014 about what design should be
right,
in a very like public, fluid way. Like they started. I guess they didn't start it because Apple did, but giving design awards
yeah.
for categories that never existed before. The advertising industry has been patting its own back for like 100 years,
Yeah.
and like turning mild creatives into celebrities. uh, people on the app side, it was just only a matter of time before someone was like, okay, we're going to start the appies and we're
Yeah,
going
of
to give
course.
10 top awards, and next thing you know, oh, they're the Academy picking the best films, or they're the Grammys picking the best artists of the field because they got there
They
first.
just
Like,
took the initiative to do it.
they
Yeah.
branded and got there first. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. Um that's
But
interesting.
when it comes to like laying the seeds to so I think that's a great insight, but it's also a longer term strategic play. Like where would you go fishing? because like what you just talked about is laying a trap.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. So I think career fair is definitely phishing. I've seen people fish on LinkedIn, like fish on Angel List.
Oh, for sure, AngelList.
Slack is another great place to fish. Although, like, I think you need to maybe build up a little bit of credibility in some of these communities. Like, there are a tons of Slack communities that focus on different things. Like, I'm in like one of these huge iOS ones, and people post jobs all the time, and I almost always read the postings because like these are all people that I've like talked to a bunch and like have helped me solve
Mhm.
problems, and like I respect them, and so like if they post something like, even though I'm not like in the market for full-time work, like I'll read it, and sometimes it'll be for contract work or whatever. But
Yeah, yeah,
it's another
yeah.
great way to like just get into one of these communities where there's people that are hanging out that may or may not be interested in
Yeah.
opportunities or whatever.
Oh, a tiny aside here. It takes a while to find, vet, and hire and get talent on board, but there is a need like that day when that posting goes up. It's not like none of these people have the foresight months in advance. They have the need that day. So as a freelancer, I found a lot of success in being like, hey, I know this is a posting for a full-time role, but I also know that you probably have needs now, and I would like to be the stopgap.
Yeah.
Would you would you consider a freelancer from now until you make that hire? And that's worked really well for me.
Yeah, same for me. I've definitely had a couple jobs that way, and those ones have led to like other referrals and that sort of thing.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, that's great freelance advice right there. Is like don't ever assume that a full time listing is purely a full time listing. Like I found that in those cases for me personally, like it works the best when you're not talking to like like front people, right? Like uh, personally, like I've had better results if that's coming from somebody that's like behind the hiring folks, because the hiring
Oh
folks
yeah.
are typically just programmed to, you know, immediately reject anything that's not a full-time offer. But like if you can get a hold of like the VP of whatever, CTO or whoever, creative director, whoever actually is the person that needs that person, then you have
Oh yeah.
way more likelihood of success because they don't give a shit. Like they just want, they
It's the
just
startup that's under 30 people who, and the posting is by the CEO.
yeah,
or
yeah.
yeah.
Yep, totally, totally. Um,
When it comes time to fish for design talent, aside from just putting out a posting, I think LinkedIn's strong. Greg Ray's had a story about how to find design talent, and it was essentially go to Dribble and search for talented designers in your area who have zero postings up.
Interesting.
So, and this is why, because any designer who's on Dribble, by the way, Dribble for the community is a invite only design social network. It used to be based around the fact that designers could give work in progress, real time feedback during a project lifecycle. But what it's really become is just another portfolio site over the years with like comments like great colors.
Hold on. Let me guess. I think I figured out the play. All right, let me see if I
All
can
right,
guess.
what is it?
You want the people with no postings because those are probably the people that are already employed somewhere and they don't have time to actually go on there and post that stuff because they're just
It's either that or their bar is so high that they don't know what they want to post yet. So here's the cross section. It's they have a portfolio on the site, but it's linked off to Behance or a personal site, and it's great.
yeah.
But they think highly enough of their work in the Dribble community that they're nervous about making a post.
That's interesting.
Because your first post, if you're a rookie, your first post gets a shit ton of eyeballs. It gets put fun of like the entire community. And if you blow that chance because you put up something mediocre, that chance is gone forever.
Oh, that's interesting. I had no idea about that kind of dynamic there. That's
Well,
crazy.
this is how it was for like, I don't know. This is how it was 6 or 7 years ago when and Greg claims this is how he found Mallory.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
then that's a successful a successful
Yeah.
technique.
Very successful. Mallory's a phenomenal designer.
Yeah. Um, That's awesome. Yeah, it's kind of this is kind of the equivalent to that. I think on the tech side is like look at people's GitHub profiles or whatever, and like I routinely balk at that because like if you look at my GitHub profile, it's just a wasteland of like nothingness right now. It's like I uh, people that have tons of time to dedicate to open source either they're not employed and they're doing that for whatever out of the goodness of their heart and thank God for them because I use a lot of that stuff. But I think a lot more commonly it's people that are doing it as part of their company. So like
Uh-huh.
I would never ding somebody for not having if they work at some company that's not super open source friendly, to not have like a big GitHub thing, because they've just been spending all their time working on their own stuff or whatever. So it's like,
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's a toss up with all these like public things. I honestly like, one thing that you said that's interesting that I've heard recommended, and I personally would recommend this to anybody, is like, you should, even if you're like super new, like have your own website, like put your own website up, like outside of all of these things, and like
hmm
collect whatever you can show on there to demonstrate what you've worked on and everything. Because like, number one, it's just good to own your own shit. Like, you don't want like to be totally beholden to one of these other platforms that might just disappear tomorrow, or whatever. But like, I think it also shows like, it shows a level of personal initiative and kind of willingness to brand yourself and all that kind of stuff that I think is impressive to people. I mean, it's certainly impressive to me when I see it. So,
for sure.
and it's never too early to have that. So,
Yeah, I totally agree. On the design side, if you're going to be applying for a role where you make custom websites for people or design custom experiences for people, your portfolio site should be a custom thing. Like
yeah,
it should
yeah,
be. And I have my own, of course, but I haven't touched it since 2009 because it's no longer like it's no longer about that for me. Like I think there's a point in your career when you graduate from here's the amazing objects that I've created to here are the amazing stories I can tell about the work that I've done and the value I've delivered,
yeah,
and then ultimately like here are the other people I've pulled up from junior to mid level to senior.
right.
It's about so. I guess those stories could be on a portfolio, but my portfolio now is on Behance, and it's an Adobe professional version of it. No one can tell that I didn't do it.
It certainly looks a lot nicer than mine, although that's to be expected.
Well, I just don't want to put the time into doing the development side of it, and I don't want to pay anyone to do it either. So why not use one of the off-the-shelf things? That's the
Yeah,
point of my career I'm in. But when I'm screening for a new hire at Chewy and at Raise Labs, oh yeah, they better have their own thing that they made.
yeah. The funny thing I've seen so many times on the developer side is like, developer will go, and I was a victim to this earlier in my career. Like, I'm gonna make myself a website, and like, you don't just pull, you're like, I can't just do the off the shelf thing, right? Like, I got to build it from scratch and use some new thing that like, that's hot now, and like, and it ends up spiraling out of control from like a content project to a big ass development project that never finishes. And so like, eventually I was
Yeah,
just like, you know what, screw this, it's just going to be WordPress, and I'm going to like use a nice looking template, and that, because the point of it is not to like spend 2 years architecting some crazy ass web project. It's like, I just need to get my thing up there and have a blog and
oh for sure.
have some links and references and stuff, and that's it. So, all right, great. Let me think
Wait a
of.
minute, are you still there? Yeah, there he goes.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
was futzing with the mute button on the mic.
um, I think we're about at the hour now. Yeah.
We started a little late.
Start a
Let me
little late.
go back to the real. If there are any quick questions we could answer.
Yeah. Did we get anything? I mean, that'd be pretty interesting / awesome. But I don't know if anyone.
Whoa! I just got a text. Sorry, and it's a freelance opportunity that I'm pretty excited about.
Nice, nice.
Anyway, no, the questions that I had written earlier, and this is from the other side of the coin, I think. As you kind of mentioned this. You know what lead code is?
Yeah, yeah. It's one of these like, it's one of those like coding marketplace kind of things. I think that's one of the ones where like you have to pass one of these rigorous processes, and then they'll like hire you out at some like reduced rate or whatever to you kind of thing.
Oh,
Um,
really?
no, you know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking of TopTal.
Oh,
Um,
yeah, yeah, total. Oh, I have a top tell story. I don't
yeah,
want to
yeah.
tell it here.
The Lead Coder's just the pure programming challenges one, right?
Yeah, it's almost like a gathering of all the intel on all the hiring practices from these top companies,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they soak them all up, and they're like, okay, I guess it costs money to subscribe to.
Yep.
I would charge for this because these developers can just crank away on all this, potential homework, and then when they get in the potential hiring funnel, they just blow everybody out of the water.
Yep.
And the reason I know about this BS are two places. There's a website called Rooftop Slushy. Yes, it's based after Big Head's experience at Ghoulie on HBO Silicon Valley. But it comes from the guys or the gals from Blind app, which started as a workplace gossip app where people shared salary information, hiring practices, what it's really like working in this design org, what it's really like working in that engineering org.
Yep. Yep.
I learned a lot just by like reading all that crap from Blind. They are making attempts to monetize it now for a couple of years with this rooftop slushy service. But everyone on that fucking thing talks about leak code.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. I mean, it's one of those things where, like, if you want to work at Facebook, Microsoft, Google, or any of these big companies, it's really the big tech companies. And there are definitely reasons to work there. Like, they pay super well. It's a very secure income, very secure job most of the time. Like, you don't really see these companies going through layoffs almost ever. The stock plans are good, and you can work on you could potentially work on pretty impactful stuff, right? Like, it's possible that you get side cornered into some nonsense that like nobody ever gets to see or cares about, but there's a lot of opportunity to work on really interesting, like, sort of groundbreaking stuff. So tons of good reasons. But if you want to work at one of these companies, you have to play the game. And the game is like, study up and like learn all of this crap that you'll probably never use on the job, and go through the ritual of all of it and do it, right? And so that's why you have this whole cottage industry that's kind of built up around it. Because that's just the price of, it's the price you pay to enter into one of these companies, and it is what it is. I think it sucks, and like there even been like Google even conducted a study a few years ago that you can find pretty easily if you search for it, where they basically concluded that their interview practices are only like 10 to 15% effective at like actually actually identifying good candidates versus shitty candidates. But the problem is they have no other alternative right now, because they literally and there's a great post that Eric Dietrich, one of the he's like one of these freelance dev guys that's has a lot of really interesting writing on this stuff, but he has a really good post about kind of why that's the situation, and a lot of it just comes down to volume. Like, they have such a high need for people, and they have so much volume of people coming in that they need to screen, that they literally have no other option besides having like a one size fits all kind of programming, exercise funnel or whatever. Like, they can't do what a startup would do and take more time to evaluate somebody on like a deeper level, or cater the evaluation to somebody based on their experience level or any of that stuff. Like, it's just, that's really what it is. It's like the fast food of interviewing.
Yeah, they've set up a ropes course. They set up a ropes course over there.
Yeah,
and here's the line.
Right.
You can get in the line and go through it, and as you start to cross this finish line, if you make it, then you can get into the in-person interview.
Yeah, totally. And so it is what it is. There's not much else to be said about it. Like, you can opt in or you can opt out. Like, there's a whole world out there if you want to opt out. There's plenty of companies that don't make you go through that kind of crap, or that have like explicitly rejected that kind of stuff, that you can have a very successful career without ever opting into it. And there is actually, from that same post that I was talking about, he actually talks about an interesting idea, which his assertion is, if you really want to work at a Google or one of these companies, like, don't waste your time on their stupid interview crap. Just go build some open source thing, or some other, or like a smaller company or something that's a good acquisition target for them, and they'll probably just buy you eventually. And there you go.
It's going to be an acqui-hire situation with a bunch of intellectual property that changes hands, and you're going to make bank and have an easy career afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. It's,
well, I mean, you know how hard that is. Get serious, though.
But I mean, honestly, though, you could probably do. I wasn't trying, and literally, there's been 2 times over my career where potentially could have ended up being a Google employee, because of like potential acquisition stuff. So like, if you consider that, and the fact that I wasn't even trying to be in that situation, if you really wanted to go that route, you probably could. You probably could find some startups that are good acquisition targets and for, like, and kind of make an estimate and do that sort of thing. And a worst case scenario is like maybe the startup just gets acquired by somebody else or goes public and you cash in or whatever. But I don't know. I found it to be an interesting thought process of like, well, if you really don't want to do that bull crap, like here's another sneaky way to try to get into the door.
Well, just like we were saying at the beginning, you probably learn a hell of a lot more going that route than going through the gauntlet of leak code, etc., levels, FYI, and all, and then applying through all those channels and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I've often wondered like how much what kind of credentials do you have to just flat out reject that stuff and still get invited in? Because
I think that's changing. You know, like that's a great question, but I think it's changing over. Google just put out like a 6-month course program that they said takes the place of a college degree in their, hiring practice.
Yeah.
Did you see this?
Yeah, I did. And it's smart, and I'm not surprised at all. And it's timed perfectly, right? There's a lot of discontent right now with universities in general because of how things are going right now. And like, I think that whole thing is getting shook up. So I think it's prime time for Google to swoop in there and be like, hey, actually, if you want to opt out of that and save yourself a shit ton of money and still come work here, like, okay.
Exactly. Yeah. No, it's awesome. Flipping the monstrosity that higher ed has become on its head. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, how long before you start seeing like your like Price Waterhouse or your like, Goldman Sachs or any of these other huge like financial companies or whatever starting to do the same thing? Like,
you're putting out a boot camp.
Yeah, don't worry about you don't need to go get your 4-year business degree with your 2 years of bullshit gen ed. Like, here's a 6-month, 1-year thing. We'll certify you to be a CPA or whatever, and like you'll pay us way less than you pay University of XYZ, and here you go. Like, I don't know personally. I don't know why they're not doing that.
Experience, Nick. What about all the humanities courses and the weird play you're going to get to see and the drinking beers out of a Frisbee on the quad?
Yeah, I know. I digress, I suppose.
That was my shout out to Ben Johnson and Bowdoin, by the way.
My views about this have changed precipitously from the time when I was actually in that situation to the time where I now have kids that I have to actually fund through that. So now I'm much more on the side of like, we need to just destroy this entire system. They can go to 6 months of Google Ed and,
Well, I think the distance learning thing is really accelerated it too. And part of the reason, that I'm kind of okay with Wyatt. He's going to be 11 in a month, doing 5th grade behind a computer and through a distance learning model that's how business is done. And I think it's going to be done in the future, not completely, but I've had to interface with people for 6 months now. Well, actually a little bit more, because of the freelance thing, but it's all through shared documents, computer programs, emails, calendars, and Zoom meetings and shit like this.
Yep.
So the sooner he, gets comfortable with the suite of Google products or whatever route he chooses to go, he and Minecraft too. Like he types back and forth to his friends and like puts little cheat codes in, and he's voluntarily taking his time to type for the first time.
Yeah, it's we live in a totally different world. I mean, it's interesting the way this whole thing is forced change, and not just education, but like our industry and all that stuff too. It's like,
people are saying this is, hey, I don't have to have an office anymore.
Yeah, I don't think there's a lot of
fully remote.
Yeah, totally. And I think there's a lot of good that's going to come out of that. I think like offices are not going to go away entirely, but I think business travel to a large extent is going to be like reduced permanently because I think. Like I just think we've proven that this whole setup has gotten better enough that like you really don't need it as much. I think in offices, I think we'll come back to a certain extent, but I think a lot of them won't. It's like it's interesting. Yeah, that's another thing we could do a whole show about is like in person versus remote and like the sort of product focused organization and like what does that mean for the future and. Because I think I've been a huge proponent of remote for a long time, obviously, and like, but I think there was especially I think when you're earlier on in your career, there's definitely a lot of value in being next to somebody.
For sure, and it really depends on the type of work you're doing too.
Yeah, absolutely.
And
But
whether or not it's focused around problem solving in a team, um, a great deal of that does go on asynchronously and through focused thought by yourself. But I think I found the true magic happens in actually selling your ideas to other people. It happens in person.
yeah, I think
Yeah.
that's true, and I also think like when you're like sort of further off in your career, it's a lot easier for somebody to trust you to be able to just say like, okay, you go solve this problem and come back to me in a day with like what you came up with. But like when you're
Mhm.
much earlier in your career, it's 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 easier to go off like down into rabbit holes that like you shouldn't, and if you don't have somebody there to help you along with that and tell you and to be able to bounce stuff off them frequently and say like, well, what about this? Like, should I do this or how should I do that or should I do this? Like, it's helpful to have more direction when you're at that level, and like I
For
think
sure.
that's easier when you're in person. And so like I don't know how that works going forward in this whole thing, and you know yeah, it's crazy, but um, it's I see both sides of it like many things. Certainly this was a forcing factor for something that I think we already started seeing the beginnings of it. So
Yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah.
All right. So, any ideas of what we're going to talk about next time?
I don't know. I think we should do a little
Let's get our listeners to,
brainstorming.
we're of course we're going to storm brains, but
Yeah.
maybe our listeners have any specific questions they can get on it. Um, I don't know if we touched on enough. A topic I really love to talk about is getting your first job and managing your own career. You know,
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
a creative side, I don't think anyone out there from like a creative director or a manager type setting really knows what they're doing when it comes to mentoring young creatives. Because quite honestly, I think for like the last couple of decades, all of that fat in the industry has been taken out of it, and everyone is just really heads down. Everyone's delivering value on client stuff and not exactly honing teams the way that it used to happen.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I think it's a good topic on. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good engineering topic too. Is like I think when you work at any company, you always get that like typical like where do you see yourself in 5 years? And like I think it's good to try to figure that out for yourself before some manager type person asks you. And like I don't.
I in my estimation, not many people ever asked that. They didn't care, or they were too busy to plant the seed.
What do you mean by that? Like in terms of you haven't been asked that, or you think you haven't?
No, 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 no. I think a lot of young creatives are mistaken in the fact that anyone else gives a shit or is responsible for their success.
Ah, okay,
Like
yeah.
they are personally responsible for it, and they need to manage up the entire way. And if they don't know that, they're gonna lag for a while before they get frustrated and then realize it and then have to rethink everything. You
Yeah,
know?
I agree. I agree. I think there's a lot of unhappy people working for many, many more years at companies that they shouldn't be because they're waiting for the company to give them the opportunity they're looking for, and
Exactly.
really they should just quit and go find it somewhere else on their own, right? Like I think,
Well, or just manage within the organization. I think it's possible, but it only comes to people who put pressure.
yeah,
Squeaky wheel gets the grease type
sure,
stuff.
sure, yeah, totally. Um, yeah,
All right, hey, listen,
maybe
I have
that'll be
a
next.
call.
That's a good one.
All right, well,
Um,
we'll talk about it. Maybe we'll get some other questions. I got a call in 15 minutes. I need to kind of prepare for it though.
all right, sounds good. It was great talking to you, my friend, and we'll see you next time.
Okay, love it.
All right,
Bye.
bye.